Okay. Well, hello. My name is Tim Daly, and I am the director of the Joyce Foundation's Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program. And thank you for joining today's discussion in our Lunch and Learn webinar series on emerging research into gun violence. For today's discussion, we're so excited to be joined by two national experts to discuss their research on the public's attitudes towards the issue of political violence and how gun owners in particular view this topic, an issue that is particularly relevant as preparations for the 2024 elections are now well underway. Before we dig into today's discussions, just a few housekeeping items. First, today's webinar is being recorded and in the coming days will be made available on the Joyce Foundation's website. And after today's discussion, we'll be sure to share a version of the slides and other key materials that are referenced in today's webinar. Again, today's webinar will last about 1 hour, with the final 20 minutes or so being reserved for your questions. And to that end, if you have a question for today's speakers, please include it in the Q&A feature found at the bottom of your screen. I would encourage you to submit your questions as you think of them, even if the speakers are still presenting. So with that housekeeping aside, let's jump into today's discussion. As many of you are already very aware, acts and threats of political violence have surged in recent years. The Brennan Center for Justice recently found that office holders serving in local and state government across the country, as well as those serving in other essential capacities such as poll workers, have faced a barrage of intimidating abuse and threats. As planning for this fall's elections ramps up, officials are already taking steps to mitigate or de-escalate these threats. To discuss these trends and their implications on the upcoming election, we're pleased to be joined by Dr. Garen Wintemute, Professor of Emergency Medicine at the University of California, Davis, and the Director of the California Firearm Violence Research Center, and Rachel Kleinfeld, a Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Wintemute is a renowned expert on the public health crisis of gun violence and a pioneer in the field of injury epidemiology and the prevention of firearm violence. Dr. Wintemute has conducted and published findings from numerous studies on gun accessibility and the connections between gun ownership and violence. He's also testified before Congress and served as a consultant for the National Institutes of Justice, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Rachel Kleinfeld is a senior fellow in the Carnegie's Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program. Her work on troubled democracies facing problems such as polarized populations, violence, corruption, and poor governance bridges the United States and international cases. Kleinfeld's focus on the intersection of democracy and security has led her to regularly brief the governments of the United States and allied democracies on issues of conflict, the rule of law, policing, and security sector reform. She's also consulted for the international organizations such as the European Union, OECD, and the World Bank. So we're so pleased to have both join us today. And Dr. Wintemute, I'll turn the floor over to you to get started.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming. Let me just lay out an overview for the talk. I'm going to focus very specifically on the findings of some survey research that we have done, and Rachel is going to give a more general presentation. Researchers, this is ordinarily a research sort of webinar. You are not the primary target audience today. The general public, policymakers, the media are the primary target. I'm going to mention the methods of the survey briefly, certainly happy to respond in the Q&A. And again, everything that you're going to see today is published and the methods are available in detail. So let me share screen and let's get to it. Can somebody give me a thumbs up that
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. So we are off to the races. The survey project began with monitoring that we were doing of firearm background checks, NICS checks for firearm purchasing, which are displayed here for you. The pre-pandemic period is off to the right. We were expecting to see a surge in purchasing in the pandemic, and we're geared up to follow it and study it and look at its sequelae. The red line shows you NICS checks as they actually occurred, the actual counts of NICS checks The blue line on the right shows you what would have happened during the pandemic years if the trend established during the previous years had continued without interruption. And you can see that there was a huge increase in background checks for firearm purchases in 2020, as I said, as expected. But it didn't tail off to the degree that we expected in 2021. And I went looking for potential causes for that continued upsurge in purchasing. And as we like to say, went down a rabbit hole, uncovered an entire body of information, which I'm going to sum up using a quote from Cynthia Miller Idris at American University. And Cynthia, if you happen to be on, thank you again. Cynthia told the New York Times on June 7th of 2021, so almost exactly 3 years ago, a lot of people want to see January 6th as the end of something. I think we have to consider the possibility that this was the beginning of something. So long story short, we initiated a survey, and let me tell you briefly about the design of the survey before we get to the results. It's conducted every year at the end of May and the beginning of June. The 2024 questionnaire happens to be in the field at this moment. It's nationally representative. I'll tell you the sample size in just a moment. It's longitudinal. And what that means is it's not an interview, it's online. We are contacting the same people over and over and over again so that we can look at within individual change in response to various external events and changes in beliefs and so on. It's a high quality sample. It's called the Ipsos Knowledge Panel, which is an address-based probability sample. The first wave of the survey, which we're going to focus on today in part, had 8,620 people in the main sample, but an additional nearly 4,500 people, so close to 13,000 people altogether, so that we had adequate numbers of firearm owners. Tim mentioned we'll be talking, Californians, not talking about them today, transgender people and combat vets, and they are also going to be subject of separate analyses. Completion rate in wave 1 was 56%. Completion rate in wave 2, the 2023 survey that we will talk about, of people who responded to wave 1 was 84%, which is really quite high. Here's what we found. We made a bunch of assertions and we asked people how much they agree with them. And what you see here are the percentages of people who strongly or very strongly agreed with the assertions that you see in quotes. This is the exact language that the survey respondents were given. So 2/3 a serious threat to democracy. Nearly 1 in 5, when given the choice, chose having a strong leader over having a democracy. 16% endorsed the core delusion to replacement thinking. Almost 1 in 10 strongly or very strongly agreed that our social institutions are run by Satan-worshiping pedophiles who traffic children for sex. And about just under 1 in 5 thought the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. But the focus of the survey was on political violence. So we asked people first, do you think political violence is justified? And just a moment on definition. We defined violence, we actually used the term force or violence in the survey, and we defined it as physical force sufficient to injure or harm someone. And political violence, we actually used the phrase violence, which had just been defined, to advance a political objective that you support. So these are people who said that violence as defined was usually or always justified. 3% in general. 1 in 3 adults said that violence was usually or always justified to advance at least one of 17 specific political objectives, and 3 of them are listed below there, that we presented to them. And on average, if people said yes to 1, they said yes to 6. About 1 person in 20 thought violence was justified to return Donald Trump to the presidency in 2022. Again, about 5% preserve an American way of life based on Western European traditions, kind of a dog whistle to the right. More than double that for a more general statement to preserve an American way of life I believe in. On balance, we had about 5% supporting, as usually or always justified, any one of the 17, but it added up to a third supporting at least one when all 17 were considered together. Then, if people supported political violence, and only if, so see the red language at the bottom, these percentages that you're seeing now are of that 32.8%. We then asked, okay, it's sort of put your money where your mouth is questions. How willing would you be, you personally be, and you personally was underlined in the questionnaire, to engage in violence and in some different ways? First, by type of violence, and that's what you see here. So of those who thought violence was justified, about 8% were personally willing to damage, very or completely willing to damage property. Another and higher percentage were somewhat willing. About 5% very or completely willing to threaten somebody, injure somebody, kill somebody to advance a political objective. We asked that same group, the people who thought violence was justified, how willing would you personally be to use violence against somebody else because of who that person is? And again, these percentages are those who said they were very or completely willing. And it was about 5% across the board. There were 9 of these. I've listed 5 of them here, and I won't bother to repeat them. You've by now, I think, read all of them. It was about 5% across the board. We had somebody whose political views differ from yours. We had somebody of a different religion. It was about 5% across the board. But again, the caveat, these are percentages of the 1/3 who thought violence was justified, at least in theory. Okay. Finally, for the general population, we asked everybody, regardless of their views on political violence, regardless of whether or not they own firearms, which we had also asked about, and I'll show you that in just a second. How likely do you think it is that in the next few years, and in a setting where you think political violence is justified, you will do any of the following? And you can see the responses. About 8% said, I'll be armed. About 4% said, I'll carry. About 1% said that they thought it was very or extremely likely that they would shoot somebody in a setting where they thought political violence was justified in the next few years. Now, I'm a person who sees violence as a health problem. I'm interested in seeing who's most at risk. So we looked at risk by subgroup, if you will. You're going to see several slides with this layout. So let me take a moment on the layout. The first column, the measures over there, is going to on the left, is going to stay the same. These are, I'm going to present you data for the same 3 measures for a bunch of different groups at risk. So the other columns are going to change from slide to slide. The definitions are in the lower left. So MAGA Republican in 2022 was somebody who identified as a Republican, who told us they voted for Donald Trump, and who told us that the 2020 election had been stolen. And you can see the others. And then always for these slides, down in the lower right, to give you a basis for comparison, will be the results that you just saw for the population as a whole. The 32.8% justifying at least one, 7.7% saying I'll be armed in the future, 1.1% saying I'll shoot somebody. So here we go. Notice that MAGA Republicans, as we've defined them, stand out for the very high prevalence, well over half, who think that political violence is justified in at least one instance. It's higher for strong Republicans. For other Republicans, it's basically the same as the general population value. I will be armed is higher for MAGA Republicans than it is for the general population. And for other Republicans, I will shoot someone, not really a difference. And this is something that we saw several times, that people who supported violence maybe weren't more willing to actually engage in it themselves, particularly with regard to lethal violence. So now, a new slide, new set of risk groups. We asked people, how much do you approve of a bunch of specific organizations? I'm not going to show this one, that one for the sake of time, but Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and so forth, but also movements identified here. These are the results for people who strongly or very strongly approve of the movements you see listed there. Same 3 measures. Now we go from about 1 in 3 to well over half for Christian nationalists, and it just gets worse. 90% of people who approve of the Boogaloo movement. Fortunately, there aren't a lot of those people, but their approval for violence is quite high. I will be armed from basically 20% to nearly half for those who support the militia movement. And notice for the first time what happens with I will shoot someone, which goes from 1% for the general population to 7% for Christian nationalist supporters to 1 in 4 for Boogaloo movement supporters. Firearm owners. I'm going to frame this as good news. I think by now you're used to the layout. We asked people, do you own guns? Basically, is how we got at this. Same 3 measures. The difference between owners and non-owners, as you see here, is about 10 percentage points for supporting violence. But owners and non-owners are different demographically, and when we adjust for those differences, it falls to about 5 percentage points, which compared to some of the other differences we've seen is actually, relatively speaking, reassuring. Good news, take it as you will. Not surprisingly, owners much more likely than non-owners to see themselves as armed in the future since they own in the present. But again, not much difference in likelihood that I will shoot somebody. I will say that I will emphasize that small difference is statistically significant, but there are times when statistical significance and real importance may have different answers. But now let's look at subsets of firearm owners, and this is where the money is. So subgroups of firearm owners. We asked people what kinds of weapons they owned. We asked them if they owned an assault type rifle. We asked them when they had purchased their most recent firearm. Recent purchase was during the pandemic years, 2021 or 22, half of 22. Remember, that's when the survey was conducted. And we asked people how often they carried a loaded firearm out in public. Loaded firearm out in public, other than for a job and other than for travel to and from a shooting range, et cetera. And here we find big differences where the support for political violence, the first row, is higher than it is for the general population, also than for other firearm owners, more than half for the always carriers. I will be armed in the future when I think political violence is justified. 1 in 3 for assault rifle owners, nearly 2 out of 3 for always carriers. I will shoot somebody, almost 9% of people who carry all the time. Let me put that in perspective. I'm going to go beyond the slides for just a moment. The almost always carriers accounted for somewhere between 10 and 20% of all firearm owners in the United States. And about 10% of that group, 9% of that group, think it's very or extremely likely that they're going to shoot somebody in the future to advance a political objective, which for me translates into there are thousands of people who are, at least in theory, committed to political violence, who are armed and on the streets in the United States every day. An update to 2023. Support for political violence, as we've been defining it, decreased from 1 in 3 to 1 in 4. That's good news, but 2023 was not an election year. I expect our 2024 results will show higher levels of political support. We did find an increase in support from to almost 6% for the I will shoot someone. 2023 had some additional objectives. We measured using standardized scales, all the forms of, we call it fear and loathing around here, those 7 attributes that you see listed at the bottom. We've just released the working paper on that. I'm not going to talk about it today for sake of time, but we found 2 things, actually several, but the prevalence of each of these things in the United States in 2023 was substantially higher than we expected. It's going to be bad news. Each of them was very, very strongly associated, not surprisingly, with support for political violence, with willingness to commit political violence. And there were some additional patterns that I'm not going to mention, but the paper is available. Finally, we asked about civil war. In 2022, 14% of adults in the United States agreed strongly or very strongly with the statement that, quoting directly, in the next few years, there will be civil war in the United States. We were really taken aback by that. Another roughly 30% agreed somewhat. We were close to 50% of the population agreeing with the possibility of civil war in 2022. That fell, as you can see, substantially in 2023, not an election year. Again, I suspect we'll see support having increased again in 2024. And for goodness sakes, there's been a movie, not just a lot of violent rhetoric. But we expanded the inquiry in 2023, and we found that 39% of the people who in 2023 thought civil war was coming also agreed strongly or very strongly with the statement that you see there quoted, that the United States needs civil war to set things right. Probably not surprisingly, we found that both the expectation that civil war was coming and the perceived need for it were substantially greater among populations that we had shown in 2022 were more supportive of political violence than others were. And in the survey that's in the field now, it's bad luck to talk about a survey before you get the results. We are asking, so which side will you be on? Let's assume it's a right-wing insurgency. Which side do you take? It's a left-wing insurgency. Which side do you take? We're asking people, suppose large-scale civil conflict breaks out. What are you going to do? And the responses vary from, I'm going to leave the country, to, through several intermediate steps, I will be a combatant, I will kill somebody on the other side, I will kill a non-combatant. Somebody has to ask those questions, and we're doing it. So let me pull us back. This is my last slide, Rachel. I'm going to pull us back from the abyss and talk about the good news that we see, because and we can talk about this in the Q&A. 1/3 of the population rejected political violence. Fine. Excuse me, accepted political violence. 2/3 of the population said no, over and over again. All of those 17 objectives, and we added more in 2019 and got the same result. Most of the people who endorsed political violence in theory said, but I don't want to do it myself. And in those findings, I think, may lie grounds for motion ahead. And I'm going to stop sharing. And Rachel, give the stage and camera to you.
Thank you so much, Garen. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully that'll work. Can folks see those slides?
We can see it great.
Great. Well, Garen's job, I think, was to scare the dickens out of everyone. And my job is to level set, let us all breathe for a minute. So I'm going to take a historical perspective at the beginning, just to lay out where we are in US history. I want to talk about how political violence is dialed up or down by politicians, a little bit about what's happening right now, and then what we expect to see in the fall, and then what we can do about it to reduce the likelihood of violence, because just because people say things doesn't mean they will do things, and there's actually quite a lot we can do drawn from international and domestic cases to reduce likelihood. So with that, let me jump into these slides. So first of all, the US has always tolerated a great deal of political violence compared to other like democracies. And generally, we get these big outbursts that occur fairly regularly when the dominance of a major group is threatened. So that first picture is of the Know Nothing Party. It's some political propaganda showing Irish and Germans, represented by their favorite beverages of choice, stealing a ballot box. Tilden or Blood was the 1876 violent election. So we've had this before. It tends to happen when America undergoes major racial or other demographic shifts. And since the 1960s, we've undergone a very large racial shift, mostly thanks to the 1965 Immigration Act, but also huge shifts in gay rights, women's rights, all sorts of different groups challenging social dominance. But that alone is not enough to cause this kind of re-outbreak of violence. The other thing that we see is that our political structures in America are very given to violence. When we build democracies overseas, we just don't build democracies like our own, because winner-take-all elections, first past the post elections, where you win one extra vote and you get the whole seat, are given to election suppression and violence because there's a real incentive to win that one extra vote, to push the other vote down. Proportional elections and so on, where one extra vote doesn't get you much, just don't have that incentive structure. We particularly have that incentive structure when Congress is up for grabs. Most of our time as a nation, Congress has been ruled by one party for decades at a time. This is Francis Lee's work. And so there's just not a lot of incentive to push on any given race. But what we've got now is kind of a perfect storm where Congress is very much up for grabs. It's been up for grabs for many cycles now. The last time it was like this was during the Reconstruction era. And not only is all of Congress up for grabs, but there are so many safe seats now that just a handful of seats determine Congress and the presidency. So you can see how much pressure that's putting on politicians to use a little bit of violence, a little bit of suppression to win a lot of power. And that's what we're seeing in America right now. Now, political violence is a strategy. It often looks spontaneous, but it's not. Nowhere in the world. It's dialed up or down. That doesn't mean that politicians necessarily control the violence, although in some countries they do. And we did see in America the Trump campaign making connections with violent groups like Cowboys for Trump here in New Mexico, or Bikers for Trump, and other kinds of groups with the potentiality for violence, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys. We see that in other countries too. But usually the violence is committed by aggressive, impulsive people who may not even be that political. They might usually direct that aggression and impulsivity toward their family members in domestic violence, toward neighbors, and so on. But as politicians, other people, and direct violence towards certain groups, those aggressive, impulsive people learn that that's an acceptable way of directing their violence, so you get more political violence out of them. Since 2016, we've seen an escalation of political tactics, and they're using violence to destroy the opposition on the same side. So we're seeing a lot of right-on-right violence, as well as right-on-left, because they're trying to target opposition politicians too. We're seeing a lot of very specific violence to target infrastructure that stands in the way of power. So this is the electors, the people counting the ballots, state senators who have the decision-making power to certify their votes, and so on. It is not a surprise that these people are being targeted, because these are the people who stand in the way of gaining power. And then we're seeing a lot of hate crimes and so on. And what this is all about is building base intensity. You build base intensity by creating an us and a them, and othering the them, making the them feel like a threat, and feel like a threat that can be put out. And that's exactly what we're seeing toward a whole series of groups in America right now with political speech. So what are we actually seeing in the country? Well, we're seeing a lot of threats. Since the election of our first Black president, it started to go up, but really since 2016 is when you see these numbers just skyrocket. So threats to Congress up tenfold, serious threats to federal judges way more than doubled, serious threats against state election officials. About a fifth of them are being threatened in any given 3-month period. And in big cities, the numbers are much higher. San Diego found 75% are being threatened, sometimes by people within their own body. So senators threatening other senators, for instance. Most of this is threat, but we are seeing violence. So hate crimes are at the highest point in the 21st century, and that's with FBI data, which is notoriously horrible data, partially because we're getting fewer and fewer police agencies voluntarily reporting. So with 400 fewer agencies reporting than at the beginning of the century, you're getting these kinds of rises. This is really not great, especially when compared to the data that Garen just shared about willingness to commit these kind of violent crimes. But it's really important to say that these are mostly threats. They don't differ a lot by party. They're mostly coming from the right. They're not entirely, but they're against the right and the left. And they're mostly threats, not actual violence. As someone who works in countries like Kenya and Colombia and so on, it's a really big thing to remember that our country is not in that situation. We can still really stop this. Once you get into violence, you get a lot of tit for tat that has its own internal logic and is much harder to stop. We're not there yet. And so we shouldn't bake this in as something we just have to accept. We've had it historically, and it's come down historically. And we can get to that point again. most of the threat, and this is also important for the community groups on the call, most of the threats are being directed at candidates and election infrastructure, not at voters. And it's really important that we don't scare voters into thinking that this is going to be a real violent election, because that will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's really important that they recognize that actually there's very little likelihood of them being hit. What we're seeing now is actually that Trump is having a lot of trouble creating a mass movement of violence, like on January 6th. He just called for people to come out in response to this court case. Nobody came out. He called for people to come out in response to the beginning of this court case in New York a year ago or so. Nobody came out. He's really having trouble getting large numbers of people right now mobilized. What he is getting is these aggressive, impulsive people willing to act on certain signals that we call stochastic terror. This is like, I don't know who's going to target somebody out of my millions and millions of followers, but if I put a target on someone's back, somebody's probably going to act. We're seeing a lot of that. So we're seeing a lot of judges, juries, witnesses being targeted. Again, this is not random. It's someone trying to use violence to change outcomes that will hold back power. We saw the same thing against prosecutors in all of the other cases, judges, juries, and witnesses. So right now, we shouldn't be expecting mass gatherings. We should expect more of this stochastic terror. It doesn't make it pretty. It doesn't make it okay, but it means that you need to be looking for the right thing. We're also seeing a lot of swatting and bomb threats. So there's not somebody out there with a gun, apologies to Garen, but it's people calling in the police on special counsel Jack Smith on Christmas Day, stuff like that. This is really cheap. It's really easy. It's hard to trace often if you use VoIP, and we're seeing a lot of it. We're also seeing more violence from the left. While most of the protests for pro-Palestinian causes were peaceful, about 5% were not peaceful. And so we're seeing a small number of individuals who are becoming more okay with violence on the left. Now, left-wing violence tends to be property crime. Right-wing violence tends to be against people. But what we know is that when you get protesters and counter-protesters together, you tend to get more violence. And so there's more likelihood right now of left-wing counter-protesters getting close to right-wing armed people, and that would be real bad. So let's turn to the election season and election day. And we're starting to see some dry runs. We saw this in Portland too. When people get used to the idea that they actually can commit violence, that's a real bad thing. It's hard to commit violence actually against a real person, and you don't want to make people more used to it. So we're starting to see that with these protests, and it's part of why the more violent protests and counter protests, this is a counter protester, not a protester, a pro-Israel protester. You don't want that. We're also seeing dry runs for what the state can do against peaceful and violent protests. The police were called out against over 100 peaceful protests this spring. Not great for what we might see on election day. So what might we see? A bunch of us researchers agreed and put our names at the bottom, our organizational names at the bottom of what we might see. But basically, on election day, we're expecting very little violence. In very few countries do you see violence on election day, and mostly only in very weak countries. So very little violence on election day. People should come out to the polls. They shouldn't be scared. There might be some sporadic activity here and there, but there's a lot of lawyers and a lot of organizations all ready to quell anything that happens. So we really shouldn't worry too much about that. Instead, during the campaign season, we're expecting to see an increase in targeted hate. This is the othering when you're building your intense base into an us and a them. This has racial components, and it's definitely going to have gender components. We're seeing hostile sexism really rise. Part of that has to do with who the voting base is on the conservative side. It's much more male. It's also more minority. And so we're expecting to see somewhat less of the racial catcalls and somewhat more against immigrants, who many minority members also are against. And so looking at the targeted hate, pro-Palestinian, anti-Palestinian, anti-Jewish, university presidents, foundation leaders, that's the sort of stochastic terror portion of this, judges and juries, and then immigrants, women, and minorities. And it, again, will probably be mostly from the right, but not all from the right, also from the left. Post-election is actually the most worrisome time because we're going to have a period with a lack of clarity. We have 3 swing states that aren't allowed to start counting absentee ballots until the day of the election, and one of them even the evening of the election. So there's very unlikely to be a call of who won the night of the election. And that in-between period is going to place a lot of pressure on people who want to come out and become angry and armed. And if the left comes out angry and armed as well, and you get protests and counter protests together, or you get the state quelling protests, you can kind of have an escalation effect. So we're real worried about the post-election period, and that's where I would really focus on what to do. So I want to close with what to do, how we address this problem. And I want to think about it in terms of 3 levels. There's the trigger level, the time and a place where violence is most likely. You know, you've got a protest and there are counter protesters. What do you do? There's the amplification level. Who are the people creating a climate that says it's okay to use violence, it's okay to use threats? And then at a very deep part of the iceberg is the incentive level. What are our policies and political structures and so on that are incentivizing this kind of activity? And how do we deal with those? So just in terms of things we can do, the first thing, and I don't have it listed on the slide here, but it's actually the most important, so I'll add it to the slide before you get them, is at trigger points, so at the election day, around the election period, and especially in the post-election time, we need a lot more joy to the polls. Working Families Party and other groups did a lot of this during the 2020 election. It's incredibly important. It's much harder to use violence if there's a bouncy castle at a poll. It's much harder to use violence if there's a DJ and a concert going on, if there's happy people in community, than if you have 2 angry groups facing off against one another. And so the more we can do to have joy, positivity, community connection, that forces more angry people over to the margins. Along with that, you just don't want the angry people getting close together. So this has to do with things that a number of groups are doing, like training the police, time and place laws about gun control, separating protesters and counter protesters. Groups like States United and ICAP, which Garen mentioned earlier, are working on all of these things. I know someone asked a question about, do we expect a lot of police violence? There are certainly some bad police out there and bad sheriffs out there, but it's really not systemic. There are a handful of agencies that have more systemic problems in them. But what I'm really more worried about is new police. We just had a huge retirement of police that were hired in the 90s and have retired between the 2 elections. This will be their first election. They're going to be scared. They're going to be anxious. They're very young, and they're likely to act without necessarily thinking. And so helping them by telling police, if you're going to have a demonstration, making it easy for them. Don't make it a surprise. Don't be scared of interacting with the police ahead of time so that their own anxiety level can come down, because police violence is most likely when they're high on anxiety themselves. Then there's the amplification level. We need to build more resilient communities. This happens right now. Reach out within your communities to groups that might be more willing to listen to other members of the community in order to tamp down violence. So that might be trying to get people who represent parts of the further left and further right groups, not necessarily to agree about anything, but to agree about, can we all say, let's tamp down violence, let's tamp down rumor, let's be willing to speak against that. And that's going on right now. There's a number of groups organizing the right and the left in swing states to do just that. And you can do it too. It can happen at a community level. The media, this is really, really important. It's easy to see figures like what Garen's presented or what I've presented and think that your job is to talk about the likely violence. It is not your job. It is the job of the media to stop normalizing violence and to really uplift all the people working against the violence, because that is the vast majority of our country. The majority story is how many people don't want this to happen and are working against it. So we don't need to aggrandize with pictures of guys with guns. We need to emphasize agency. These are things that the United States teaches in other countries. It's called conflict-sensitive reporting. We're not doing it here, and we need to start doing it soon. And then on the incentive structure, and I'll stop here, this is deep work. It's not really this election season work, but if it doesn't happen, we're going to keep having these problems. We need to change the political incentives so that that pressure on each election in an electorate that's this close doesn't keep happening election after election. And that means changing our primary structures, having more ranked choice voting, fusion voting, different kinds of voting mechanisms, so that you're not just playing to your base if you're a politician, but you have to play to the general electorate. Because as I said, the majority of Americans don't want any of this. They're actually very tired of this. And along with that, cracking down on the economic grift that's making money off this kind of violence and fear. So I'll stop there, and I think we're both really thrilled to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rachel and Garen, for that wonderful presentation. We've had some questions starting to come in, and just wanted to remind folks that you are encouraged to add your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You'll have a pop-up where you can add your questions to the queue, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the time we have available. Starting off, Garen, in relation to the survey data that you shared, since this is self-reported, do you think people over or underestimate their willingness to engage in political violence?
I'm going to answer that question, but I'm going to do something else first, and I'm going to do them briefly. I want to tie my good news at the end to Rachel's good news at the end. So you heard both of us say that most people reject political violence, and even of those who think it's okay in principle, most of those people say they wouldn't want to do it themselves. How we move forward is not just the media uplifting that part of the story, but it brings a responsibility to all of the rest of us who do reject violence and or don't endorse it personally. We need to be that story that the media can tell. We need to be very public, all of us individually, about our opposition to the use of violence to solve political and social problems in the United States. Our history notwithstanding, I'm going to be the historical naive here, Rachel, our history notwithstanding, it's not what we should do now. So let's not do it. I'm a physician. I think of the decision to engage in violence as a health behavior, like the decision to smoke, the decision to drink, to eat wrongly, etc. There's a wealth of research showing that people's health behaviors are influenced profoundly by the behaviors and the statements of the people around them, their family, their friends, the people at work, the barber or the stylist, the clergy person. And we are all those people for the people who are contemplating violence. We need to cooperate in creating a climate of intolerance for violence as part of making this work. Carrie, give me the question back again.
The question is, since this is self-reported, do you think people over or underestimate their willingness to engage in political violence?
So always possible. And I'll say there's probably some over-reporting here, because if you look at the numbers of people who say they're willing to kill somebody and the numbers of homicides we actually have in the United States, there's just a huge discrepancy. Having said that, one of the reasons we deliberately took questions that had been asked before and incorporated them in our surveys is to at least get comparability. And every place we did that, we most of the time got the same responses. The findings are internally consistent, and the trends over time make sense. I think all the risk is on the side of assuming that there really isn't a problem here and people are just blowing smoke.
Rachel, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I think Garen did a great job.
Fantastic. Next question then, since the survey was in the field around the time of the Buffalo and Uvalde mass shootings, how do you think those incidents may have altered public opinions about guns in 2022?
Yeah, we actually talk about that fact in the reports on the surveys. There's no way to guarantee in advance that something won't happen while you're in the field, and those events had happened recently. The 23 survey closed data collection just before the first criminal indictments of Donald Trump were handed down. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is in the background across the entire study period. So Buffalo and Uvalde certainly may have raised people's awareness of of replacement thinking, the replacement delusion. I'll give you a present example from 2024. That survey's in the field now, and it's been in the field for a couple of weeks. I happen to be looking at the New York Times when the report came that the verdicts were forthcoming in the New York case. And by the time the 34th guilty had flashed across the screen, I was thinking, oh, damn, we're going to have to subset our results by whether they were generated before or after today. Because as we've seen, there's substantially increased support for political violence, at least if you follow the rhetoric, that began that day. So we'll look to see if that affects our survey responses.
Fantastic. Let's see. Well, and Rachel kind of got into this a little bit, but regarding the data on justifiability of political violence, Garen, your data really focused on several right-wing extremist categories, and curious if you have similar data on left-wing extremist movements that Rachel mentioned a little bit in her remarks.
We do, we haven't reported. So we collected data on Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and 3%ers, but also on Black Lives Matter and a couple of other left of center organizations. We just, the time is finite for us. Resources are finite and time is short. We went to where the bigger problem was. We will be circling back.
Great. We've had a few questions come in related to policy that I'm going to bundle together. So is there any federal legislation related to this topic that you'd recommend? Are there any state policies, state level policies that could be effective? And for example, extreme risk protection orders or ERPOs. And would throw that question open to both of you. Are there policy solutions that you see that could be especially effective here?
So let me suggest, whoops, she just took a drink. Perfect timing on my part. Rachel, you take that one first. I'll talk about extreme risk protection orders. You take everything else. You're the expert.
Well, I'll go back to the last question. So we know very little about left-wing violence. Excuse me. It's been less than right-wing violence. We do know that when you count the incidents and the body counts, but because it is growing and has moved up, there's been a very little bit of research. Most of what there is suggests that it's young men. Young men commit most violence. That's not surprising. That it's young men who claim a racial or social justice goal, or sometimes a climate goal secondarily. But when you actually kind of peel back psychological profiles, there's one study that suggests these are people with high levels of narcissism, and very high levels of hostile sexism. So, you've got young people, often quite wealthy, who are claiming a goal, but in fact, their personalities are against women and given to sort of aggressive, impulsive activity like most violent people. So they're maybe not as great as they say. On what we can do about it. So I'd mentioned time and place laws for gun control. I think these are really useful where you can get them passed, and about 12 states now have passed them, saying guns just don't belong in our polls on election day or really anywhere near them. Virginia just vetoed one that passed through the state legislature, but these are really important kinds of rules. Garen's going to get to the more individual level cases, but activities that work against domestic violence also play a role here, because there's a strong correlation between people who've committed domestic violence and people who commit hate crimes and other forms of violence. So those might work. The most difficult category are the people of the sort who showed up on January 6th. These people seem to think of violence as part of their political spectrum. They don't necessarily have a criminal history. They're older than the normal violent people. They're married with kids, more settled, they have jobs. So figuring out how to get them to not think of violence as normal political activity really falls on politicians. And there we might really consider changing some of the ways that we count a true threat. Right now, it's very, very hard to prosecute someone for threatening a public official. It has to be a true threat, and that has a lot of caveats to it. And it would be good, although I'm not expecting it of the Supreme Court, to change that slightly, not to take away our free speech, but to deter more of the threats that are really affecting who runs for office in this country now.
And for extreme risk protection orders, as Rachel said, I'm going to assume everybody knows what they are. This is an individualized approach to the problem. Remember that an extreme risk protection order, the possibility arises from a perception on the part of, let's say, law enforcement and the judicial system that a crisis exists, a personal crisis exists. So there has to be that. Extreme risk protection orders are not everybody who's trash talking on the internet gets served with a restraining order. But if there's a crisis, there are rules of evidence. They vary from state to state, but there are things a judge must consider, things a judge may consider in most states when evaluating the appropriateness of a petition for an order. And we talk about this in the most recent working paper, the one that looks at hostile sexism and political violence, racism and political violence, et cetera. And raise the question, if somebody is making repeated statements of hostile sexism or racism or xenophobia or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia that according to our results, make them part of a group of people who are entertaining political violence, at least theoretically, might those statements be introducible as evidence in a petition for an extreme risk protection order, given, again, that there's some particular individual crisis that has given rise to the petition? I personally think that's a good idea.
Thank you. Since that was looking at the policy side, one more piece on that. So you'd mentioned the policy, but you'd also talked a bit about the concern of people normalizing violence. And for policymakers, whether these are congressional offices or candidates or others in the political space, what are some of the key takeaways from this that they should be thinking about sharing?
Rachel, I think you should take that one, and if there's something from the survey that will supplement, I'll add it.
Sure. I mean, I think there's some really simple things here that are actionable. Election workers shouldn't have their names and addresses on the internet. There's just no need. You might want to also consider taking off the names and addresses of all sorts of other categories that are getting increased threat, like public health officials and so on. You can have their office, you can know who they are, but do they need to be doxxed at their homes? Probably not. A lot of our rules about sunshine and transparency and open records are actually creating real problems for individuals. That doesn't mean to close it all down, but it does mean to draw some more reasonable lines between what the public needs to know and what they don't. For instance, there's activity going on by some right-wing groups to get voter files to all be public so regular people can look at every voter file. But of course, that makes it quite possible to dox anyone with an unusual name. Minorities and immigrants are more likely to have unusual names. So it creates real possibilities of harm. You could see a voter file without linking it to a name and address and so on. So there's a lot of activity like that could be thought about. I think the groups doing the best work in that area are ICAP and States United, who are really thinking about how do we help our public officials turn these findings into policy.
Great. And that actually predicted the next question I was going to ask. I was looking at the civil society side of it, and are there specific civil society organizations? You mentioned ICAP and States United, who are good at creating solutions, amplifying resilient communities, connecting with media to encourage them to stop normalizing violence. Are there other civil society measures that you see as effective that you'd want to highlight?
I'll jump into that, Garen.
Yeah.
So there are so many, and I'm so glad to get the question. So States United and ICAP work with law enforcement, work with cities, states, elected officials, and are doing a whole lot on the sort of more governmental side. On the community side, you have groups like Common Ground USA, the US arm of Search for Common Ground. That's the world's biggest peace building organization. Over Zero, Western State Center, doing tremendous work on community resilience. You have groups like Peril at American University and the SPLC doing really interesting and important work on inoculating young people against violence and against being recruited into violent groups, which often happens in those young years between about 18 and 30, as you're actually for violence between about 16 and 30 are kind of your prime years, and they're working right there. So there's all sorts of wonderful groups. And then there's some great state-based groups as well. There's organizations that are working with the media, like Kristen Grimm at Spitfire Strategies, and The Beat with Harkin and Poynter Institute, trying to work directly with the media to get some of these lessons into the media bloodstream. We need a lot more. There's a lot of media in our country, but these are really good starts.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Garen, we had a question for you related to your research. And the individual asked that they suggested that your study seems to contradict a rather well-known study from Robert Pape at UChicago, that in this author's opinion, overstated support for violence, and wanted to know if you could comment on any differences on your survey results in that study.
There were lots of them. I reviewed Professor Pape's work when we were designing the first survey. I reviewed a lot of other people's surveys. I elected mostly to steal, borrow, whatever questions from other surveys. What that can mean is that the difference in the results simply means that we were using different tools to measure with. We went a lot further than Professor Pape's work did. It's a different sample. All of those things can account for differences.
Thanks so
and
much.
usually do.
Yeah. One more question related to the research. Do you see a connection between the increased predicted firearm use among supporters of political violence and the gun purchasing surge? And in particular, the questioner was curious to know if we know from any other research the proportion of new gun owners who fall into that category of always or nearly always carrying.
Thanks for that. He makes a note to do that crosstab. So there's certainly a temporal association. One of the right alongside the always carriers were the recent purchasers. Having purchased a gun during the pandemic years was by itself in multivariable analysis associated with an increased likelihood of support for political violence and increased risk of increased willingness to participate. We're going to be going back to those data and looking further among recent purchasers. Who is it? We're going to be, adding in some additional information to try and subset the recent purchasers who seem to be most at risk. But yes, I think in very qualitative terms, one of the fundamental concerns that launched the project to begin with, when we saw that unexpected continuation of the surge in purchasing past the initial pandemic, past the election, past January 6th, and then it kept going, my thought was, wow, are people arming up for something that's coming? And the findings on recent purchasers suggest that might be true, but we don't know that. But we've designed some questions in 2024 to try and suss that out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Garen and Rachel. I'm afraid we are nearing the end of our time here. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for those folks whose questions we couldn't get to, that we had a whole lot of interest in hearing from Rachel and Garen, and we really appreciate all of you joining us. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be emailed out in the next couple of days, along with the slides that our presenters shared. We'll also be including some of the links to Dr. Wintemuth's and Dr. Kleinfeld's research that was referenced, as well as some of the organizations and papers that had been discussed today. So we will have a lot of additional information coming soon, and thank you all so much for joining us. Tim, I don't know if you have any last announcements for folks about the next Lunch and Learn webinar coming from y'all next month, but thank you all so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Dr. Wintemute and Dr. Kleinfeld, for joining us. And as Carrie mentioned, our next webinar will be on Thursday, June 20th. We'll include a link to that as well in the email that follows. And that webinar will be exploring law enforcement support for community violence intervention strategies. So look forward to seeing you then. And thanks again, everybody, for joining us today. Have a great afternoon.